Air campaigns like this, meant to pound the civilian population into submission, never work. They didn't work in World War II. They didn't work with the fanatics in Germany. They certainly didn't work in Japan when we firebombed Tokyo. They were more fanatic than ever. They didn't work in Vietnam with the Americans, and they're not going to work now. In fact, the opposite is happening. The Ukrainians, with very, very rare exceptions, are more hardened to Russia right now, have more visceral hatred towards Russians right now than they ever did going back to 2014.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now today, on day 1233 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation, we're very privileged to be talking to David DeBatto. Now David is a retired US counterintelligence special agent and Iraq war veteran. I wonder if we were in Iraq at the same time. He writes about Ukraine, Russia, post-Soviet Europe, NATO, and anti-democracy movements in the US and Europe for the Kyiv Post. And your podcasts, I believe, and articles are available on your website, which is protectingtherepublic.com. David, welcome to Frontline.
Thank you.
Now, I'm going to start off with Donald Trump. Yeah, I know you're a great fan. He said that the US will send more weapons to Ukraine after an announcement last week that Washington would halt some of its shipments. And those were critical arms that Kyiv was expecting. It seems that announcement came out of the Department of Defense, not out of the White House. But during a meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Trump said that he was not happy with Vladimir Putin and that Ukraine was getting hit very hard. Do you see this as a real change in Trump's support for Ukraine? And should Putin be worried, or are we just getting the usual flip-flopping?
Well, let me say at the outset, I don't really care what the reason is if Trump actually does green light finally sending these weapons and these weapon systems to Ukraine. I'm all for it. However, to answer your question directly, no, I don't think this is a change in any policy. The reason being is there is no policy. Trump doesn't have a policy about Ukraine, about NATO, about what he's going to have for breakfast, if he's going to eat McDonald's or pizza with a knife and a fork or just, whatever. He doesn't have policy. He's not an ideologue. In fact, he doesn't know what that word means. If I sound like I'm rough on Trump, it's because I'm rough on Trump. I don't like him. The man is barely literate, and I'm being kind. The last book he said he read was in high school, and he probably paid someone to read the Cliff's Note version of that book. He doesn't study foreign policy. He doesn't study history. So, no, this isn't a change. In fact, I would not be surprised if these weapons, specifically the Patriot systems, which are a vital need right now for Ukraine, and I think the ones he's talking about are being stored in Poland. I wouldn't be surprised if they don't make it to Ukraine. I'm not saying they won't, but I would not be surprised if between now and the time they're supposed to be shipped to Ukraine, another order goes out. Another policy decision is made by either Trump or Hegseth or some mysterious person in the White House.
Do you think there's tensions between Trump and Hegseth? Because I'm detecting early signs of that. And do you think Trump has just got bored of the whole Ukraine-Russia thing and just wants to walk away?
Oh, absolutely. He's been bored of this since before he became president. After he became president, he really got bored because he had to deal with it. Is there tension between him and Hegseth? Yes, just the same as there is between him and Tulsi Gabbard and now Pam Bondi, Kash Patel, because when you get these kinds of egos together, and especially egos that don't really have any idea of the jobs that they've been put into, incompetence way in over their heads, they're going to butt heads. And they are right now. Actually, I just thought of that, butt heads. That's exactly what they are. And so, yes, there's this tension right there. Does that mean Hegseth's going to go? I don't think so, because he serves a purpose, as does Pam Bondi, as does Kash Patel, as does Bondino, and all the rest of them. They're useful idiots, and they will and are doing everything that Donald Trump wants. Why would he replace them, whether or not he thinks that they're an idiot, and possibly put in someone that, God forbid, would actually do their job and was competent? He can't take that step. He can't take a chance on that.
Don't worry, politicians, I think, across the world don't do their job. So it's not a unique American thing. But now let's come across to the other side and look at it. We've just had press reports of Roman Starovoit, who's Russia's recently ousted transport minister, found dead in a car in a Moscow suburb on Monday. having, according to Russian authorities, committed suicide by shooting himself. Now, since 2022, there have been dozens of suicides. There have been dozens of business and political elites seemingly taking up window cleaning jobs and accidentally falling out from the 9th or the 14th floor of different high-rise blocks. Some have fallen off the back of their speedboats, others have fallen down the stairs. Is Putin having a purge? Is that an indication of growing dissent within his supporting ranks? And do you think this is something that Putin is really worried about?
Yes, no, and yes. Yes, it's a purge, but there's an ongoing purge. I mean, he started firing generals shortly after the full-scale invasion in 2022, as well as other high-ranking civilian and military leaders. Yes, it's definitely intensified recently because things aren't going very well in Ukraine, and they're not going very well with the Russian economy. Is this because the oligarchs are getting together, or they're sensing some danger and organizing? No, they owe their jobs and, as you've seen, their lives to Putin. So no, there's not really any danger of an organized rebellion by these oligarchs. Is Putin afraid that there will be? He always is. All dictators are always afraid of who's coming up behind them, and what oligarch or what person that owes him their life is going to make a move. So yeah, he's worried about that. And I think you're going to see the purges continue. I would recommend, as many people have, that these people stay away from high-rise windows. They stay away from forests. Apparently, this unfortunate gentleman was killed in a forest and dragged underneath his window to make it look as if he fell out of the window. I would recommend they stay out of Russia, but that's not going to happen. So, but that's just my opinion.
Well, we had someone else arrested from his private plane and not allowed to leave Russia. So it seems as if Putin is either having a purge or he's sending a message to any dissenters to say, this is what happens to you if I even pick up the tiniest rumor of dissent, which shows the level of control he's having to impose.
Well, Philip, if I can jump in there, you're absolutely right. But just look at how it's being echoed here in the United States. I mean, Donald Trump, God forbid, he's at least not yet taking out his political enemies like this, out windows or shots in the head or anything like that. But he is putting out a very clear message. Don't go against me. No dissent is going to be tolerated at all. Not just from oligarchs like Musk. Look what's going on with Musk right now, with journalists, with TV and cable stations, with Hollywood politicians, his own party. You mess with me, and we're going to come after you. So that's what's going on, except on steroids right now in Putin's Russia.
But again, looking at where Russia is taking this outside Russia's borders and everything else and linked to Ukraine, we've just had 3 men arrested and convicted in London of arson against a store that was a big warehouse that was housing equipment that was going to be shipped out to Ukraine. It came out as part of the court case that these men had been recruited by the Vagner group. Now, you're a former counterintelligence officer. How worried should we be that Russia is using the Wagner group and its organized crime that's linked to oligarchs and elsewhere to recruit people to carry out actions like this, sabotage in our different countries? Is this unique, or is it happening in lots of other places, do you think?
It's happening all over Europe, not just in Britain, in the UK. It's happening all over Europe. And look, I know that the British counterintelligence, counterterrorism, and police forces, law enforcement, are well aware of this, and they're jumping all over it. My main complaint is that even in Britain and the rest of Europe, they're not taking it seriously enough. What I mean is they are not acting as Russia is, which is that we are at war. We're at war. And they're treating this as a law enforcement issue, as a separate law enforcement issue. We need to deal with these criminals. They're very, very bad. But we brought 3 of them to justice, and we're going to do that to every single one, except we're not going to ramp up our budgets. We're not going to hire new people. We're not going to go on a wartime footing. We're going to leave our military at the ridiculously, I'm talking about Great Britain right now, the ridiculously low level that it is, and for the rest of Europe as well. Russia's on a wartime footing. Part of this sabotage program, this hybrid warfare, is part of their war plans from a counterintelligence standpoint. Yes, This is incredibly dangerous. And the only way to combat it is to go on a wartime footing, which means not only ramping up the defense industries and the military, but giving the budgets and the personnel to the counterintelligence forces, to the counterterrorism forces to deal with this. If they just deal with this like this is a law enforcement program, you're all in Europe in for a very, very rough time.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, the lessons that have come out from in the UK, the counterterrorism approach, which it's our counter-terrorist police that look after sabotage and hostile state acts. But I agree with you completely. What we're seeing is this hybrid warfare, this gray zone warfare that just happens to be a constant in the background. Do you think this is a realization that we are going to have to recognize that there is a continual level of warfare that we have to just accept as part of being democratic states and deal with it?
I don't think we should ever just accept it. I think they need to deal with it right now because we have an aggressor state, which is the Russian Federation under Putin. So at this time, yes, we need to accept the fact that we, meaning the Western world of democracies, are at war. It's not the beginning of the war. It's not 3 to 5 years down the road. We need to think about this and form endless committees while we study this. No, we're at war right now. So they need to deal with it now, not accept it. In fact, they need to make statements the exact opposite, that this is not acceptable. This is not acceptable in an international world ruled by law, and we won't accept it. And make the accommodations, again, meaning allocating the budget, hiring the personnel, and stating that we are on a wartime footing. Anything short of that's going to lose.
All right, go on. I've snuck you into a meeting where we've got the European leaders. We've got the NATO leaders, including the United States, looking at how we deal with this. You've just been asked, as a final question, how do we deal with it? How would you deal with it?
I would, well, it depends what kind of power I had. If I had the power to knock heads together, I'd start by knocking heads together, literally. I would tell them that they need to change the rules. However you got to do it, change the rules, meaning that if a Hungary or a Slovakia, a FISO, doesn't allow us to continue, for example, with sanctions, a new round of sanctions on Russia, they need to go. And I know they can't do it right now. They need to have a unanimous vote. Change it. As far as every country in NATO having to make up its own decisions and its own budgets because they've got their own local concerns, the hell with it. We're at war. You need to change the rules so the EU and NATO can act unified, because that's the only thing that's going to work. And that's the only thing that Putin understands. So I would start by ordering them to change the rules. So NATO specifically is a unified command with all of the, I believe it's 32 countries right now acting in unison, elect or appoint a commander to do that, increase the budget accordingly. Okay, if you need a committee for that, then I would start a committee and I would demand the report in 30 days or 60 days. How we need to budget it. What weapons do we need? What training do we need? How large a forces do we need? What infrastructure do we need? I give them a very short time frame to do this and then order them to do it. End of story.
Do you think the time has come where the international community should suspend Russia from the being a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations?
I think they should be excluded from everything that civilized countries do. They are a terrorist state. They have broken every rule that there is. They've committed heinous war crimes that, oh my God, I don't know if they could ever pay enough retribution to make up for what they've done in Ukraine to the Ukrainians. You bet. When Donald Trump, for example, said that they should be part of the G8 again, what an insult. No, they should be not part of anything. They should definitely be kicked off the Security Council. What a joke. How can you have a terrorist nation like Russia be part of the Security Council? So the answer is a big da.
Yes. So interesting. Now, looking into Ukraine, you mentioned the attacks and the impact that's happening in Ukraine and Russia's war crimes. We're seeing increasing attacks on civilian infrastructure with drones and ballistic missiles. And there are lots of discussions around Ukraine's effectiveness in its mobilization and morale within Ukraine and everything else. You write a lot about what's going on. What, from your perspective, have you picked up is the feeling within Ukraine with regard to Russia's attacks on civilian infrastructure? Is that breaking morale as Putin wants, or is it hardening morale as lots of us commentators say it is? What's the reality on the ground?
Well, I communicate with as many Ukrainians as I can on a daily basis, whether it's through email, text, whatever. So I do have a sense of what's going on there. And no, it's not working at all. In fact, just very, very briefly, air campaigns like this meant to pound the civilian population into submission never work. They didn't work in World War II. They didn't work with the fanatics in Germany. They certainly didn't work in Japan when we firebombed Tokyo. They were more fanatic than ever. They didn't work in Vietnam with the Americans, and they're not going to work now. In fact, the opposite is happening. The Ukrainians, with very, very rare exceptions, are more hardened to Russia right now, have more visceral hatred towards Russians right now than they ever did going back to 2014. So it's having the exact opposite effect. So no, if anything, Putin has given the Ukrainians even more of a reason to fight against Russian forces.
Do you think that that's going to make it easier for President Zelensky to recruit more people into the military? Because the one thing that both the Russians and the Ukrainians are really suffering from here is people, and it's not just getting the raw people into the military and onto the front line. It's getting them through the training that they're needed to get in the front line. At least the Ukrainians give their civilians a degree of military training before they put them into formed units, whereas the Russians just seem to press gang people, put an AK-47 or equivalent into their hands, and chuck them into the meat grinder.
Well, as everyone knows, Russia outnumbers Ukraine about 3-1. And this is a critical difference. Look, one of the main criticisms that I and many, many military and intelligence professionals have had about Ukraine since the beginning is that they do not have a conscription policy that allows them to conscript men under the age of 25. I understand that. And I know why President Zelensky doesn't want to do that. I think it's wrong. In the beginning, perhaps it was a good policy. Right now, they can't afford it. There's been several articles written recently about the old men, meaning men from 45 to 70, that have been on the front lines for 3 years for Ukraine because either they don't have enough men or they want to spare the young men so they can raise families and so forth. And yes, many, many Ukrainian men have left Ukraine because they don't want to go to the front lines. But again, these are the exceptions. Here's the thing. Do they have enough people in their military right now? No, they don't. They need more. In order to gain the numbers that they need, short of drastic draconian measures, they need to change their conscription age. They need to make it down to 18. Every other Western country that has conscription, including the United, well, we don't have conscription, but we have an age of 18, 17 with a parent's permission in the United States to join the military. They need to get it down to at least, I would say, 19 or 20 in Ukraine in order to get the kinds of numbers that they're going to need, no matter what kind of weapons are supplied to them. So that needs to change, and it needs to change right away.
Well, the troops are used in the front line, and your recent reports indicate that there's a deteriorating situation on the front line. Now, as commentators, a lot of commentators are very good at measuring the success or failure of the war by how many tens of meters the front line moves, and we can talk about that in a minute. But the Chasiv Yar Pokrovsk front is the bit that seems to be collapsing. Is probably too strong a word, but putting pressure on the Ukrainian defenders. From a wider military intelligence perspective, how long do you think the Ukrainian defenders can realistically hold this line? And do you think there'd be strategic consequences if the Russians actually manage to break through in this area or any of the areas?
How long will the Ukrainians hold this line? As long as they need to. And I really mean that. I really mean that. One of the things that are not discussed enough, including some of your brilliant guests who really are much better than I am at analyzing tactics and strategy, one of the things that are not talked about enough is the emotions, the morale of the troops. Ukraine, as you've said often, they're defending their homes, their country, their families. This is an existential battle for them. That means a whole hell of a lot. So I guess to answer your question, how long will they be able to hold the line around Pokrovsk and some of these other areas? As long as they need to. And yes, they're outnumbered, but what they're doing tactically, of course, it's brilliant. They're letting the Russians throw themselves into the meat grinder at 1,000 plus per day. of either deaths or casualties, they don't allow themselves to be surrounded. Just when they are, they pull back. And the Russians leave 10,000, 20,000, 15,000 dead and wounded in that small area, and they gain 100 meters, 200 meters, whatever. The Ukrainians regroup a little further back, and they do this again and again and again. They can do this for years. And eventually, even the Russians will run out of troops for every dead Russian and North Korean and maybe even Chinese troops. So they can do it as long as they need to. By the way, just really quickly, Aravika, I think, is one of the small villages that has changed hands many, many times. And forgive me, I have to just say this. I always think of, because I'm sorry, I'm an old musical theater fan. I always think of Anatevka from Fiddler on the Roof. This was the name of their village and a great song. So, and it was actually in Ukraine. It was based on a real story. So I think the Ukrainians will defend Anatevka to the last Russian.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. And it's great that you mention this, the resolve that they've got, the Ukrainians, because they're defending their homeland. You know, we forget very often the moral component of fighting power. People will compare tank for tank and aircraft for aircraft and numbers of troops for numbers of troops. But actually, you add in that moral component, and that's the thing that gets the big change. But it's for commentators, you can't produce a nice graphic that shows that on a TV screen or anywhere else.
Well, and Philip, how many articles have there been recently in pundits that have talked about the lack of morale with the Russian troops for many reasons? They don't know what they're fighting for. They don't have any morale. And when they learn that they're really just fighting for Putin's ego, thousands, tens of thousands perhaps, have deserted. That's huge. That's really huge. And it's the exact opposite with the Ukrainian forces.
And the other thing you clearly explained there was, you know, the military tactic that doesn't come out that often, which is trading space for time. And that is a military tactic. And that's exactly what the Ukrainians are doing. You know, they traded the Russian advances in the east at the very beginning of the operation so that they could deal with the Russians trying to capture Kyiv. And then they have pushed the Russians out of Kyiv and out of that north east bit of Ukraine, and they're now trying to deal with them in the east, and effectively they fixed them in place while they're then attacking them in their rear areas at an operational level with, you know, Operation Spider's Web and all of these sorts of attacks. Do you think Ukraine is using the right sort of tactics to try and influence, from the longer term perspective, Russia's ability to continue to prosecute this war?
Well, I do. I mean, we've talked about now the tactics they're using at the very local level in eastern Ukraine and Donetsk and Luhansk about wearing down the Russians with these massive waves that the Russians are throwing at them in the strategic level. For example, the drone attacks and the missile attacks deep into Russian territory, which have just increased in the last few weeks. Yes. To take out their logistics hubs, to take out the factories that actually make the drones and missiles and the parts, the motors, the engines for the drones and missiles. It is strategically brilliant. And yes, it doesn't hurt that the locals who live near these factories see these huge explosions and these clouds going up in the sky and say, this is Mother Russia. How could they attack us here? Putin swore he wouldn't do this. You know, echoes of Hitler. With World War II, the Luftwaffe will never allow you to Berlin to be bombed. Well, it was. And now we're seeing the same thing on a lesser level, admittedly, in Russia. But just strategically, yes, I think this is a good idea. I've read recently today, actually, that maybe the Ukrainians are taking the wrong strategy, that they're just looking for very big targets and sensational stories by doing this. I very much disagree. I think they know exactly what they're doing. The planning that goes into it by Ukrainian intelligence, the targets that they've been hitting are not just for publicity. They are really hurting the Russian supply chain of weapons that are actually attacking Ukraine. So no, I think it's a brilliant strategy.
No, I remember the attack that there was on Zelensky in the Oval Office by Pete Hegseth, and then Donald Trump taking over, and Donald Trump saying to Zelensky that he had no cards to play, and Zelensky must have known that Operation Spider's Web, that very audacious drone attack on the strategic bombers and all the rest of it, wasn't just, you know, a massive set of cards that he had to play. You know, it was ones that would trump anything that was out there, and he must have, whilst he was being attacked, had a wry smile on his face inside.
Well, I said it then and I'll say it now. I don't know how Zelensky kept his temper. I mean, I do understand why, of course, he had to. But yeah, I mean, he did know this, I'm sure. He meets with his intelligence people and military every day, all night. And Trump is, I'm sorry to say it, a moron. He doesn't understand tactics or strategy or military or history. So, of course, Zelensky has cards to play. And Putin's cards to play were diminishing even then. But Trump didn't know it, and if he did know it, he didn't care. So, of course, that's a whole other story, that meeting in the Oval Office. But Zelensky does have cards to play. In fact, he's showing his cards more every day. And I think the Western pundits and leaders and the Trumps of the world are going to continue to be surprised at what Ukraine is doing to Russia.
Oh, even as you know, from a knowledgeable commentator on it, I have a wry smile when I see the latest tactic that comes out. But the impact is quite clear in Russia. As you said, they're losing over 1,000 troops a day, but they're now relying on North Korea for basic ammunition, artillery ammunition, small arms ammunition, artillery guns, rockets, and all the rest of it. And now we hear potentially another 30,000 troops. We hear of China having to supply more electronic components and getting more involved. And then the Chinese saying they can't afford to they won't let Russia lose. Should we be concerned about the further internationalization of this conflict?
Well, of course. I mean, what it says about the Russians accepting or possibly accepting 30,000 more North Korean troops doesn't really mean that the Russians don't have the manpower. They do. It says two things to me. One is that Kim Jong-un doesn't give a damn about his people either, and is perfectly willing to throw 30 or 300,000 North Korean soldiers into the meat grinder and kill them. But it doesn't mean that Putin doesn't have more resources. What he is doing, what he's not doing actually, is calling up having a general conscription. He won't do that. He can't do that, because that's when the Russian mothers would start to scream to the holy heavens. The only reason, one of the many reasons that Russians haven't risen up yet against Putin, is because their sons, their husbands have not been drafted yet, conscripted into this horrible tragedy. He's been taking people from the Far Eastern provinces, who used to be independent nations, where the people are, for the most part, more uneducated, poorer, and are less likely to protest to Putin about sending their families over to Ukraine. But when he starts a general conscription, and families of the middle class, or God forbid, the upper class from Moscow, St. Petersburg, Vladivostok, Nizhny Novgorod, and so forth and so on, when they are drafted and sent to Ukraine, that is when there's going to be a problem. And he will do anything possible to not have to do that. As far as international intervention, China doesn't want Russia to lose, because then America is going to concentrate on them. With our weapons, with our economy. We can not worry about Europe or Ukraine. We can then laser focus on China, and they can't have any of that. They're just happy as a dog with two tails that we have our attention split between Europe and China, and they want to continue that.
Yeah, well, interesting. Looking at everything that you've said and what's gone on in the last sort of week or so, do you think either side has got the strategic momentum to make a difference in the Russia-Ukraine war? And do you think that we are on a potential path for a wider global conflict, looking at what's happening in the Middle East, and as you mentioned, that the influence of China?
Well, as far as the Ukraine-Russia war, right now, no one has strategic advantage. But all Ukraine needs, and they've been shouting this since February of 2022, all they need are the weapons and ammunition. Then they will have the strategic advantage. If they had been supplied with the weapons and ammunition and training that they have been asking for 3.5 years, you and I would not be having this discussion. Russia would be defeated. They would have been defeated, no question about it. And no, there wouldn't have been World War III. And this discussion would be moot. It wouldn't be possible, or wouldn't have to be had at all. The second part of your question, I forget, if you could.
Do you think we're on a potential path to a global conflict?
Well, you mentioned the Middle East, and that's certainly a global conflict. We didn't really get into the bombing of Iran. And that's not over. As I know you followed, and most of your audience has probably followed, the bombing of Iran by American forces was not the obliteration of Iran's nuclear capability that Donald Trump said within 24 hours. Most of well, I don't know this for a fact, but I think you'd have to be an imbecile or possibly an occupant of the West Wing of the White House not to know that the Ukrainians moved a lot of their enriched uranium before the bombing took place. So even if the sites, the laboratories, and the mines were obliterated, it wouldn't really matter because it doesn't take that long to build alternative facilities if you already have the enriched uranium and the scientists which to work with them, which I believe is the case. And do you think that Iran is just going to forget this and say, oh, well, it's just, it's no big thing? No, they're not. They're going to wait until they're in a little better position. And Russia is going to help them, by the way, and they're going to redouble their efforts at making a nuclear weapon and attacking the West through their proxies. So, as the man once said, this ain't over.
I think you said Ukrainians instead of Iranians. I do that frequently as well, talking Richmond. But we all know what you meant. But David, like you, I wish we didn't have the circumstances for you and I to have to sit down and debate this. But I fear that. I will have the pleasure of having you back on as a guest at some stage in the future because this isn't going to go away. David, many thanks for chatting to me today on Frontline.
Enjoyed it, Philip. Thank you very much.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.